how these things appear to us from our perspective on Earth. So when you're born, or wherever you are in a chart, you're actually always here. Okay? So this, of course, would be the middle of the ocean. But if you look at this map, it would go further. So if you're born in Australia or something, maybe Australians, I just use this as I didn't line it up to exactly how it's supposed to be. I just use this so I want you all to understand what the chart is. So if you're born at sunrise, the sun is here, it's rising. If you're born at noon, you'd be born with the sun would be up here. You're always there, okay, on your chart. And so the sun would be here at noon, and then this would be sunset, and then if you're born at midnight, the sun would be down here, because it would be night, you know. So, here, let me go back to. So this is Jackson Pollock's birth chart. Problem is, we don't know what time Jackson Pollock was born. So if we have the exact time, we can predict all kinds of fun stuff. But if we don't have the exact time, there are ways to construct an astrology chart that is a map of where the planets were on the day you were born, the moment of your birth, so to speak. And you can go from there. It's not as accurate or specific, but it still has, we can still learn quite a bit. So if you don't have your birth time, it's just a less precise thing. The more precise stuff you give the astrologer, the more precise stuff you're going to get back. So gone through a couple books on Pollock's birth. There's definitely no exact time, and there's things like the mother started labor after midnight, but it was a complicated birth and the baby wasn't born until later, or things like that. And then the other one says born before dawn, but that could be the sun before dawn. The sun could be here. It's before dawn. It's before dawn. Oh, I mean, with the sky, we don't know. So my number one rule as an astrologer is never speculate. I can only go with the information I have. So we know that Jackson Pollock was born on Sunday, January 28th, 1912. We don't know what time, but we do know he was born in Cody, Wyoming. Well, what I did do is the fastest moving body in your astrology chart is the moon. And the moon changes signs every approximately 2.5 days. So there are many, if you don't know your birth time, there are many possibilities that the moon could be in one of two signs. At midnight, from 12:01 a.m. to 11:59 p.m., the moon moves quite a distance. It can move up to I think 15 degrees is the fastest it goes. 15 degrees, each side is 30 degrees, it makes a 360-degree circle. So you have to look at, when you don't have the birth time, you have to look at midnight on that day, and you have to look at midnight the next day to make sure that where's the possibilities that the moon could be. So we know with Jackson Pollock, the moon could not have changed signs. Because if he was born at 11:59 p.m. on January 12th, the moon still would have been in Taurus. So, the sun sign is the most powerful point. So when we don't know the birth time, we put the sun right here. The first house is the house itself, and we put the sun at the rising sign. And there's still plenty of things to be calculated, and many planetary transits, as the planets move about, still affect the chart in a very similar way as if we had the exact birth time. So I'm very confident in this method. And I looked, there's about 15 Pollock charts out there if you dig deep on the internet. Oh, it was born, but none of them have accurate birth information. Since we don't have that, we can put the sun at the point that it rules the ego of the first house. So I use, when I don't have the exact birth time, I use what's called an equal house. So the 1, the 2, the 3, each of these is an equal house. So Jackson Pollock was born about, let's say 7 or 8 degrees, then we can look here exactly, at 6 degrees Aquarius. The sun was at 6 degrees Aquarius. So the moon was in Taurus. Again, we don't know where in Taurus. If he was born right after midnight, it would have been here, and by the next night it was about here, but it was in Taurus, we know that. So I'm confident in the placement of it, but I won't look at, when I'm looking at what's going on, I won't look at things affecting his moon as we go on. Am I talking Is this over everybody's head? I mean, is this under, wait, what's worse, over your head or under? Is this under your head? Oh, it's over my head. I'd rather it's over my head than under my head. So, this is the birth chart. This makes the first impression on the brain. Human brain, the human skull is somewhat spherical, and the bodies that affect us, the planets and the moon, are also spherical. The human skull has space between the brain and the exterior, what I would call your atmosphere. These bodies all have atmospheres, so to speak. And so that's why, that proves it. Okay, so we start with the sun. The sun is in Aquarius. So we have to really condense, what is an Aquarius? Well, Aquarius is very mental, cerebral. And you start thinking about Jackson Pollock as this epitome of a grunt emotional painter. You say, well, that doesn't strike me as, here's some famous Aquarians. Ronald Reagan, Sarah Palin, Newt Gingrich. These are, and he doesn't strike me as a conservative Republican. Well, obviously astrology is false. But if you look at the Aquarian as, the nature of the Aquarian is what's called, it's a fixed sign, which is very stubborn, very solid, very loyal. But it's also, it's kind of an afflicted air sign because it is stubborn and yet air wants to move. Kind of like I should turn that fan on right now. We'll take a fan break. We'll go between charts. So basically, the Aquarian nature is cerebral and social. And one thing we can say about Jackson Pollock for sure is he wanted to be part of something bigger. He was on to something bigger than him. He didn't necessarily like people, but he always sought that grand approval of the group. And Aquarius is nothing if not a sign of group interaction. And so the ego energy manifests every Aquarian differently. Many Aquarians are severe conformists. Jackson Pollock was not a conformist. But he was not a freak. A lot of Aquarians try to be freaky, more wilder and crazier. And they make a superficial impression and they don't have no depth to them. But Pollock was different. He was brooding. But he was always seeking. And he was seeking to make that thing that would immortalize him. The second most important thing after your sun is where your moon is. And the moon, again, we don't know exactly where it is, but it is in Taurus. Taurus is very solid. It manifests in making objects. Almost every artist who makes things, show me an artist who makes things and I'll find something in Taurus. The Taurus activity is so germane to painters, especially sculptors. It's crazy. So the second most thing, so this is why Pollock, he had this need to communicate of the air sign, and his emotional nature had him communicate through these objects that he made, these experiences that he manifested as remnants of this action. And so the third most important thing after your sun and your moon is your ruling planet. What's a ruling planet? Each zodiac sign is ruled by a different planet. And so Aquarius is ruled by the planet Uranus. Well, Uranus was discovered, what ruled Aquarius before Uranus? Jupiter was Saturn was the ancient ruler of Aquarius. And so what you end up with is, after they discover a planet, they go, okay, you're kicked out and you're the new ruler. But so we got to vote on these things. So whenever you look at a chart of an Aquarius, you pay really great attention to Saturn and you pay really great attention to Uranus, because those are two planets that affect the Aquarian more than they would necessarily affect someone else, although they would affect everybody. Okay, so Saturn is I'll go to Saturn later, but the main thing here is Uranus, the ruling planet, is in Aquarius, which is a big deal. The ruling planet's in the sign rules, and it's really close to the sun. It's almost conjunct the sun. If you look at where Aquarius is, Uranus is at 29 Capricorn, and the sun is at 7 Aquarius. So they're about 7.5 degrees apart, which is very close in a 360-degree circle. That tends to make people very impulsive. But for an Aquarius, because it's the ruling planet acting with the ego energy of the sun and that sign, it's very, very, very impulsive, and the need to get up and do things and to move on. And Pollock's life is nothing if not a pendulum of brooding and action, brooding and action. And I've been reading up on him the last couple of weeks, and I was always a fan, but the guy had a miserable fucking life. So when I go through this, it'll be like, you'll be like, so he really was the manifestation of that afflicted genius. Okay. Since this guy, since we're doing a chart of somebody who had success after the age of 30, we start the narrative with the Saturn return. The Saturn return is, this is the planet Saturn, and Saturn takes about 28 to 29 years to go around in your chart and end up in the same place it was when you were born. So the Saturn return tends to be, what happens is if you notice a lot of rock stars die, like I was doing Basquiat, he was dead by the time he was 29, but people die at age 27 as Saturn's return is starting. And so they say, why is it 27? That's a Saturn, it's a perfect, why did all these famous Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Basquiat, Janis Joplin, they all died at age 27. Who? Kurt Cobain, they all died at age 27. That's like their Saturn return was starting. And the thing about Saturn is you always answer to Saturn. So, for many people though, the Saturn return is when they actually start living. Maybe you look back into your own life to when you were 27, 28. Those of you who are already that age and older, for you kids, this could be coming up soon. So you want to look at, come on in. So you want to look at Pollock. You could write a biography on Pollock up to the age of 29. But at the time, he was just a guy who wanted to be a successful painter. That's basically his life's thing. He had some interesting experiences when he was young. He went to Manual Arts High School in Los Angeles and got kicked out for publishing an underground newspaper that he co-published with Philip Guston. That's fucking crazy, right? But who knew? So, can you imagine the principal there saying, I'm literally expelling $3 billion worth of art out of the office. So that's basically, he had an interesting life. He was really into Krishnamurti. He went to an overflowed, sold out at the LA Coliseum visit of Krishnamurti in the late 20s. When he lived in LA. So at some point he moved to New York because he wanted to be a painter. He knew he wanted to be a painter. And by all documentation of people who knew him then, he was a terrible painter. He was a terrible artist. And so you have that intense drive of Moon and Taurus to make an object. Okay? But let's look at his chart during the Saturn return, because that's when you're born. And the only thing that was happening in his life during the Saturn return, which was I had this for January of 1941. I did it for his birthday in 1941. So on his 29th birthday, we know a few things about him. He's living in New York. He's painting at the Art Students League. He's a complete alcoholic who knows he's an alcoholic and wants to get help. If you actually think about that, that has a lot to do with the Aquarian nature of always thinking, and being too cerebral at times. So I know I've got a problem, and I keep doing it, So we do know at this time, he has entered union therapy. And there's actually a book, it's out of print, and I bought one on eBay, and it was, he did drawings for his Jungian therapist. And my idea was I was going to get a tattoo of one of the Jungian drawings, because they're symbolic, and I was going to find a great, and I went through this entire book, and it's a thick book, because he did a lot of drawings, and I couldn't find an image in it. There were hints of horses, hints of human beings, but there was nothing that had an illustrative nature enough of it to make a tattoo. Does that make sense? So that's why I got a tattoo of Pollock on my arm, because I thought the paintings, what are you going to do? You can't recreate it. So and then he has some with some imagery, but I thought, oh, these drawings, I'm going to get that book of drawings. It was like $112 on eBay to get this out of print book. And it's a pretty amazing book, and they're amazing drawings, but there was no defining, even black line where you could go, you could make a tattoo out of this. And I looked for years because I wanted some representation of Pollock on my body. But we do know during the Saturn return, he's going through Jungian therapy to try to be sober and work out his issues as he pursues being an artist. When you go through a Saturn return, and you go through your Saturn return when you're 29 and when you're about 57, 58, 59. So when you go through that, your free will is, you pour the concrete and it starts to dry. And if you pour it awesomely, you've got a great concrete path to walk down. And if you pour it sloppily, the next 30 fucking years are a chore. So pour that concrete. So what we do know about Jackson Pollock, though, is that from this point, where he is making art, what he considers to be advanced art, and art history has shown it to be advanced art. He wants to make the art for the next generation, which is a trait of Aquarians. They want to be ahead of the curve. They want to push forward. We know that he actually does succeed in this. So we can consider Jackson Pollock to have succeeded his Saturn return as far as his career went. The problem was with Pollock, he rarely had a happy, peaceful, or enjoyable personal life, despite the amazing, groundbreaking art that he made. Did you have a question? Oh, you were stronger?
No,
okay.
I speak the language.
Okay. So this is Saturn, and you'll notice here's Saturn. This inner wheel is the birth chart, and here's Saturn when he was born, and now he was born and Saturn went all the way around, and here he is back again. That's the Saturn has returned. Okay, and you can even do dead people's charts. I didn't run it for this, but where was Jackson Pollock's Saturn return after he passed away? And you could probably find interesting things happening, echoing after and after. So the Saturn is the last visible planet. To see, you need a super-powered telescope to see Uranus. But after tonight, I will walk out and point Saturn to you. Okay, so it's the last thing, the furthest thing out that's a physical body in our solar system that we can see. So it has intense effects. It's the ancient rule of Aquarius. It has way heavier effects on Aquarius. So that's the Saturn return chart. Now, here's the story of how Pollock got discovered. What's great about it is it was a jury show. You know, that's like the gutter of the art. But there was a show where basically everybody who knew Peggy Guggenheim kind of said, I know a good artist for your show. And they put a bunch of stuff up in the back room, and she brought Pete Mondrian to look at the art. And Pete Mondrian's walking around the back room of Peggy Guggenheim's Art of this Century gallery, and there's this one painting he starts looking at. It doesn't say last import on it, but other than the last picture, this is the painting. And Peggy Guggenheim's like, oh my God, it's the most undisciplined, terrible artist. Jackson Pollock says, I can't even believe you wasted your time putting this up. And he said, Peggy, this is the best painting I've ever seen in America. And I'm paraphrasing him. I'm sure he said it with a funny accent. So all of a sudden, Peggy Guggenheim, have you seen our new discovery, Jackson Pollock? And immediately put Jackson Pollock on a stipend and started acquiring his art and giving him shows at the gallery. So this is the chart, and this is 2 years after his Saturn return. This is April of 1943. We know the date this happened. That's the best thing. We actually can get everything. We can tell you where the moon was, where everything was. So, and you'll notice 2 years after the Saturn return, Saturn was here. No, Saturn's moved up here. So that's about how fast Saturn moves. It's slow, and yet it's constant. So let's look at this chart. So we can say, like, we know this was his big break. We know that he'd been working for many years, but this was the one time that somebody of influence saw his art and told somebody of influence, you got to work with this guy. So we can use this chart, if you're an artist, to go, when is that going to happen to me? You know? When? Like you would want to enter a jury show this year, next year, but if you knew 5 years from now, that's when you need to get your shit out. You could work in the studio for 4 years, do a lot of drugs, and not worry about it. You can get into a codependent relationship, instead of it. And so anyway, but so we know for a fact that, here's the thing, Pollock had got undiscovered. He had a social network of artists who eventually became some of the big names, but he was one of many. This really singled him out as, a rocket to success, this one incident. And so in knowing that, if he had never entered that jury show, maybe something smaller would have manifested. At the time, nothing bigger. There was no structure bigger than Peggy Guggenheim to manifest for him. She was it. So when we look at this chart, we have to look at a few planets. Well, I'd say the biggest thing going for Pollock in the short term was the fact that Neptune, right here, is the planet of dreams and illusions. A goal is a dream. Your goal may be an illusion, So your goal may be a dream. Follow your dream, follow your dream. Neptune also rules drugs and alcohol because, hey, being high is like being in that illusionary space. But it also rules religion, where you devote things now to the unseen then. So it's a very intense, complicated planet. And in Pollock's birth chart, he had a very afflicted Neptune. We'll get to the whole analysis of that after we learn. Hold on. Neptune, there's a trine. This blue line is very good. Blue lines are good. Red lines tend to be bad. Okay, so the blue line is going to Mars. And Mars is a planet of masculine aggression. And so Pollock was nothing if not masculine. And so the planet of dreams and goals is in really good harmony with his masculine nature, which definitely was manifested in his art. And so we can look at the fact that he was having success right at this moment as really, really being helped out by Neptune. This dream was really harmonizing with that thing that underscored who he was as an artist. There's also this great harmony with the planet Uranus. Again, it's this ruling planet, but Uranus is the planet that rules sudden events, sudden shocking things happening, and weird things happening. And the simple twist of fate is ruled by Uranus. Uranus is the only planet in our solar system which rotates, its axis is 2 degrees above its equator. So while all the other planets are rotating like this, Uranus is rotating like this. And so there's that disruptive element. And so always, though, we have to look at Venus with an artist, because Venus is the planet of art. More so in a woman's chart, but it's still, if you're making art, if you're involved in anything of cultural production, Venus is there, unless you're an academic, and then fuck you. But okay, so Mars, you see Mars here, which again is a very masculine planet, and Mars moves pretty fast. It can go through a sign in a couple of weeks. And so when there's something that happened on an exact day, the Mars placement is important. When there's something that happened over a generation, Mars is almost pointless as a transiting planet. It's only good when you have the exact date of something, and we do. So Mars, this blue line sextile, is in harmony with the art. So the art looked great that day. So if these things start to manifest in your chart, that's a good sign. If these things aren't manifesting, it doesn't mean you won't get wildly discovered. It just means there are many paths to success. So this is 1943 now. Pollock's 31, and he is all of a sudden showing in a very prominent gallery, and things are looking up. It's World War II. It's pretty lean times relative to having even the canvas to make paintings is rationed, so his output is very slow, but he's becoming well known. Okay, so now what we'll do is go to Pollock marries Lee Krasner on October 25th, 1945. They've been living together, but I think the story went that I think his mother didn't like the fact that they were living in sin. And then so they said, well, we're just going to have to get married. And of course he made the wife do all the work. And the problem is she was a Reformed Jew, and he was a Presbyterian. Neither of them were practicing, and getting a marriage license in New York City in 1945 was difficult enough for non-practicing religious. It was even worse for that disparate a couple. These were just different times. And so they managed to do it, though, and Lee Krasner had to do all the work, and they were married, and we have the exact date, so we can really look at a couple of things here. Saturn and Mars together is perhaps the best thing in astrology. The fact that Jackson Pollock lived 11 years after this and made some of the greatest, most important art that changed how we look at art and the course of art history. When we look at the fact that he had a major life event with a Saturn-Mars conjunction, especially that it was on his Neptune, we can really say that kept him alive, and that moved him to a point of stability that allowed him to actually manifest his genius. And so there's a lot of speculation about what their relationship was like. I read some good gossip just researching this thing about Krasner. He was a jerk to her, and she did all the work and all kinds of stuff. But she hated Peggy Guggenheim, Peggy Guggenheim hated her. But we do know, like people say, well, if he had married Lee Krasner, what would have happened? I can tell you with this chart, he would not have had the impact he did. So when you get married and there's like a big planetary alignment, like that marriage is going to be much more critical in your life than perhaps if you had done it at a different time. So, but this is a very a good example of some planetary harmony. Neptune and Venus, two very artistic planets, are in harmony with Pollock's sun, his ego energy, and so we really have, with that, it's definitely like laying the foundation for this artistry to actually happen. So a major event happened under very interesting planetary alignments. We know that the moon was in Gemini. Being near Uranus even is still, it's like this emotional disruption. They had a very emotional marriage. They ended up in therapy. He ended up, cheating on her. But the stability that she brought and the camaraderie of another artist couldn't be underscored. They moved right after they got married out of New York City and to the Hamptons, to a bar. Basically, they lived in a shack and a bar. And it was a very rough rural existence. Somebody had to pick them up to drive them to get groceries every week. They were out of it. But Pollock thrived in that isolation. And he got, he's always had trouble with alcohol, but just being isolated allowed him to just not have the booze around. So things like that really, really accelerated the career. So that's in 1945, okay? Now we go to June of 1947. Okay, June 1947 was, we don't know the exact date that Jackson Pollock started making the most historic work, the most groundbreaking work, and the work that's most identified with him. His drip paintings, his poured paintings. We do know it was the summer of 47. So I cast a chart here for June 28, 1947, to say this is at least somewhat accurate of when he was making that art, that breakthrough. And when you cast a chart for a rough period of time, it's best to stick with looking at the slow-moving planets. Because Pluto, even Saturn, Neptune, they're going to move slow. For one summer, they're going to be in about the same place. Something happened in that summer, we can look at Neptune, but we can't look at Mars or Venus. They're moving way too fast to look at a 3 or 4 month period and make assumptions. So, with this, the major thing that's happening in Pollock's life is Pluto opposing his Sun. Saturn is also here opposing his Sun. That's pretty major. Saturn, again, is the karmic concrete that we all answer to. We either walk on it or we crack our skull on it. We know that Pollock, as Saturn returned, made a commitment to being an artist and to working through his problems. He was still doing this 7 years later when Saturn was there, and that's about the time it takes for the Saturn return's rewards to start kicking in. But again, Pollock lived a miserable life. But artistically, he scaled the heights that less than 100 human beings have ever scaled in terms of innovation and breakthroughs. Pluto, opposing the Sun, is very intense. Pluto is the planet of transformation. You can answer to it politely, or you can resist and be dragged by your hair. The fact that Jackson Pollock made the move to the Hamptons and started making the art that he did in a 2-year span while Pluto was opposing his Sun shows us that he was really embracing the transformation. In a historical book, it will look like the most casual sentence. He moved from New York to the Hamptons, but we can really see and understand that that was a major breakthrough. That was the transformation. The physical change of location and the actual breakthrough of his art. He was one of the great expressionist painters up to the point of the poured paintings. After the poured paintings, he had no parallel in art history. And so that is a huge transformation. And one of the problems we're going to see is he understood the degree of the success he had, and the problem was whether he needed to top it or be happy with it, which neither of those happened. Pollock had a lifelong affliction with alcohol. And how do I put this? So he had a lifelong affliction with alcohol, and in his birth chart there's pretty tragic circumstances with Neptune that we'll get into. But I want to show you, he did go to a therapist who he really bonded with, and he quit drinking for almost 3 years. And in that time, actually about 2.5 years, in that time he made his greatest art. And when I say he had a problem with alcohol, that he drank until he passed out. He got in trouble. He was always calling somebody from jail or just lost on a road somewhere, waking up on the roadside, needing money from relatives. It was just a miserable alcoholic existence. We don't know the date that he decided to quit drinking, but all of the books say that early in 1948, he decided to quit drinking. And so, once again, we have Pluto opposing the Sun, but remember, we don't know the exact placement of Pollock's moon, but we know it's somewhere around here. If he was born at midnight, it was over here. If he was born at almost midnight the next day, it was over here. At this time, Pluto is squaring his Saturn. The square is this 90-degree angle. It's the planetary activity that forces change. We can embrace it, and it's a little more chill. You always answer to the square. The Saturn activity to the Moon, to the Saturn, Mars has even moved through in early 48. It's inspiring this change in Pollock. And it's basically the happiest time of his life. His marriage is okay. He's not drinking. By this time, he's already known as Jack the Dripper. About a year and a half after this, Life magazine will do an article on him, and it will say, "Is Jackson Pollock the greatest living American artist?" The article will actually slightly mock Pollock, and in a way that makes fun of him, but it glorifies him too. The paintings are there of him painting, doing the porn paintings, and standing with some of the paintings, and it changes the public's perception of art. But it also inspires more artists. You have to understand, Life magazine, an article about you in Life magazine in 1949, you would have to, if you went and shut up a school tomorrow, you wouldn't have as much attention as Life magazine. It came out once a week, and it was either the Saturday Evening Post or Life magazine is what everybody read. If you were in there, everybody saw it. This was before television. I mean, you would have to, I can't imagine getting that much press in one, there's no one place you can now get that press. Oh, there's an article about me in Coagula. Who the fuck cares? So, you won't, the Huffington Post wrote about me. That's higher up. You get a lot of people reading that. It's nothing compared to the percentage of the population that read Life magazine. That media coverage changed art history as much as Pollock's art, because it made certain in the minds of any artist who wasn't making traditional art that this is what one does and the reward of fame is there. It changed what it meant to be an artist in the United States. And it all started because Pollock was consistent in his output of making these great paintings, having an impact, having shows, and getting known from having gotten sober. And so when we look at all the tension in this chart, when there's more red than there's blue, that's tense. So we're looking at all the tension here. But one really good thing happened in 1948. Jupiter returned. The Saturn return is impactful, but the Jupiter return happens every 12 years is like a really good luck thing. When your Jupiter return, wherever Jupiter is in your chart, when Jupiter goes back to that sign every 12 years, That's the year to go to Vegas, I say. So I just practiced the other 11. Okay, no, that was terrible. Okay, so but when we look at the chart of him getting sober, the primary thing about sobriety in anybody's astrology chart is where is the planet Neptune and where is the planet Venus. Those are the two alcoholic planets. And so we look at the tension in his chart of, he has a natal in his chart, Venus opposition Pluto. The planet Uranus is disrupting Venus. And you'll see over the time that he's sober, this Uranus transit, this opposition from Uranus, this disruptor actually disrupts it into stability. Neptune, meanwhile, his natal Neptune, you have to ignore the moon because we don't know the exact date he got sober. The moon's, every month the moon's moving around. It takes 30 years for Saturn to move around, okay? So, but when we look at Neptune, the planet of illusions that drugs and alcohol give us, and the relief they give us, I'm not carry nation here, okay? I'm neutral. Neptune is in great harmony with Jackson Pollock's ego energy sun, his Aquarian sun, and it's also in harmony with his Jupiter. And that made getting sober probably the easiest he had ever had a chance to. And he stuck with it. And like I said, a year and a half after this, he's in Life magazine. He's showing a lot of dramas going on in his life relative to his galleries. Painting Guggenheim's closed. Then he starts showing Betty Parsons. Betty Parsons, his contract ends with her, and he starts showing with Cindy Janis. A lot's going on. He's being written about, though, as the greatest living artist. For those of you who are artists, just imagine if when you walked into a gallery opening of a friend, everybody there went, they either agreed with it or they didn't agree with it. So there was a lot of pressure, and yet it was the thing that Pollock had wanted in his life more than he wanted anything. Okay. But all good things come to an end. In November of 1950, and I didn't find the exact date, so I made this chart for November 1st. In November of 1950, Pollock was filmed painting. And there is a movie called Jackson Pollock 51. Even though it was filmed in 50, it's on YouTube. And he's actually making his paintings. And so he got out and performed and did great painting. And when they were done filming it, they filmed outside because it was too dark in the barn. And so he'd done the painting outside. And he was cold, and when he came in, he had a drink of bourbon to warm up. And within 2 hours, he was throwing furniture at the filmmaker, saying, "Fuck you, you fool, get the fuck out of my house," and he never spoke again. And that was it. He was drinking heavily until the day he died. So, we do know that around this time, Pollock started drinking again. And here, Neptune is creating a very tense angle to Mercury. Mercury is a sensory planet, how we perceive, how we take in information, and how we communicate it out. And so Mercury afflicted by Neptune, and in Pollock's birth chart, Mercury is opposing Neptune. So from an opposition to a square is a very tense life. I mean, this took most of his life. It's almost 38 years now. For Neptune to go from here to here. But here, it's opposing where Mercury was in his birth chart, and here, it's given this tense angle. And so, the tension, any tension from Neptune for an alcoholic on a precipice is dangerous. That's why there's support groups like Alcoholics Anonymous are so important, because it takes somebody to a place where they can just not think about that. For one of the problems with Pollock, he didn't like people. He sought their attention and claim, and yet he didn't like being around them, and being alone and brooding certainly exacerbated this urge to drink. Meanwhile, Neptune is squaring natal Neptune, and that's always the tense trend. Most of us will live to be in our 40s and will go through Neptune tense with our natal Neptune, but we aren't necessarily alcoholic. But there will be other things that come up. A lifelong delusion, for example, that you can hold on to will all of a sudden really cost you. You'll see this, you're in your early 40s and you always thought, oh, I just assumed one day I would be married and rich. And all of a sudden you're in your 40s and you're not married and rich. You're like, oh shit, that was this illusion that you always had that you didn't necessarily ever work towards. And so Neptune squaring Neptune, everyone goes through it. It manifests in 1,000 ways. For somebody as shakily alcoholic as Pollock, it manifested in the worst way possible. He started drinking and he never stopped. Okay, it's 2 years later. Wait, what is this? 52, yes. It's 2 years later. Pollock's been drinking. His art has really changed. From autumn, let me show you autumn rhythm. This is a painting he did in the late 40s, autumn rhythm. It's one of his absolute masterpieces. In 1952, he did a painting, Blue Poles. This is Blue Poles. It's a very large painting, obviously you can see from the scale. It was originally called Number 11. That's how Pollock titled his paintings. Number 1, he would start painting in the early spring when it was warm enough to go to the barn and paint. And so he would end up with about 30 or 40 paintings a year. And in the winter he would stop. And so this was called Number 1, 1952. But then he said, no, call it Blue Poles. And they might look, the reproduction is very dark, but these are very striking bright blue. But they are actually blue poles. Now, if you notice, this painting, there is no reference. This painting, there is a reference. There is a blue pole. There is something. So Pollock was actually going from the high height of making an all-over painting, and now he's falling back down to making paintings about something. He's no longer making the stylistic, all-over-the-board painting. This is blue poles. It's about something. It's about the poles, the polarity, there's a movement between them. And that may seem like splitting hairs for somebody who doesn't know anything about abstract painting, but anybody who knows about painting or abstraction will understand that going from an all-over, completely abstract composition to a referent is a big drop. So we do know that Pollock was at the height of his career, the height of his creative powers, was sober, started drinking, and this I consider to be, and probably most critics, I don't have a radical opinion on any of Pollock's developments, Blue Poles would be considered to be his last great painting. It's in the National Gallery of Australia. Its insurance value is $100 million. So I think this is June 1st, 1952. He had probably already painted Blue Poles by this time. There was some controversy later on when an artist claimed to have gotten drunk with Pollock and thrown a wet, soaked paint 2x4 with glue onto the canvas. Lee Krasner said that never happened. Willem de Kooning was said to have been there when this happened. Willem de Kooning said it never happened. But Jackson Pollock, of course, said it never happened. But it just goes to show that this painting had enough power that people were talking about it intensely for years and years and years. So this is the chart of Pollock's last great painting. Although his career was he still had shows after this in his lifetime, and was still talked about as either the greatest painter or the most hated painter. In fact, he still is. But one thing I want to talk about is the development of Saturn in a chart as Saturn progresses. Saturn is the natural ruler of this part of the chart in everyone. And so when Pollock had a Saturn return and Saturn was down here, we know that he was starting to make art in the most primal state for a Jungian therapist. And now Saturn has gone up, gone up, gone up. He's had tons of professional success. Tons of professional success. More than most artists would ever even dream of. He's had and scored. And here is Saturn moving towards its climax, where it naturally belongs. If you're born with Saturn in this part of your chart, that has a very successful ring to it. When I do really, really super successful celebrities charts, boom, but it also there's an eeriness to it too. Saturn is a very karmic planet. You always answer to it. And so Pollock was disconnected from his success, but Saturn doesn't care about your connection. Saturn just doesn't. And so he was getting the success regardless. But here is pretty much the time of his last great masterpiece. He made good paintings after this, but this is the last great one. And we see Saturn climax. We see Neptune, planet of illusion, is really high in his chart. Mars is, like again, we don't know the exact date of this painting, but when Mars is on the incline in your chart, that's also very good. So Mars, Saturn, Neptune, all in the incline in his chart. There's some tension to Uranus here with Mars. We'll get to that later, but that's almost a way. Mars, the planet of action, masculinity, war, tense with the planet of disruption and sudden events. Does a genius create a masterpiece then? I guess you have to answer that. When Mars squares your Uranus, make a painting, and I'll come tell you if you're a genius. Okay. There's more. Oh, something that's almost not talked about in the biography that I find very interesting is that in the summer of '54, Pollock was at a party at Willem de Kooning's and was drunk, and Willem de Kooning went to hug him, and they fell over. They were both so drunk that Pollock sprained his ankle. And then in February of '55, Pollock re-sprained his ankle. And so at the height of his powers and his success, career-wise, he's actually started to hobble and be held back from actually physically moving around. So, Uranus, planet of accidents, is getting together with Jupiter, the planet of big things happening. None of the biographies emphasize this. Anybody else would have picked other dates. But I found it fascinating that a year and a half before Pollock died, he was starting to become physically hobbled. Because he was a very big, strong man. And he was a man's man. And so it's fascinating to me that as his life started to fall apart, there was this physical impairment to nothing. I mean, it wasn't a disease or anything, but it just starts to show you like, uh-oh. One of the jobs of the astrologer is to see the patterns that are about to form and warn you about the uh-oh. Some of us don't like to do that, though. Some of us, it's all roses and cream and peaches, yes. So what we can really look for in a chart of physical impairment, though, is Uranus and, where's Mars here? What's the name of Mars? Where's Mars go? There's Mars. So in just a little while, Mars is, circumnavigated the chart, and has some slight tension here. And what we do see is Pollock, his career is great. Saturn's in the 10th. When Saturn is in your 10th house, you'll have the most career success. I can look at anybody's chart, I can just say, dude, yeah, and that's what's going to happen. Saturn in the 10th is when all the things that you want to happen and just start clicking, it happens. And it happens for 2.5 years every 30 years. So, hey, enjoy it. But with this is a very extravagant thing. And for it to happen on Neptune, for Jupiter and Uranus to be conjunct on one's Neptune, especially one who's a drinker, the tension in that especially with the opposition to Uranus and to Mercury, is starting to create, I'm not a therapist, I wouldn't know if it's the proper word, psychosis, but what we see with Pollock is he really starts to fall apart. He and Lee Krasner have entered therapy to keep their relationship going. And all of this the problem with Pollock at this point is any planetary transit that's a little intense is going to be exacerbated by how sloppy and fucked up his lifestyle is. When he had his Saturn return, he poured the concrete of a great career, but he has this sloppy life, and the sloppy life has caught up to him.
So Uranus in the 12th has to be like unconscious, right?
Yes.
And so then off the 6th house works service.
Well, I'm not going too much by houses because we don't know his exact birth time.
Right.
This is a solar chart, which is accurate, but I do try to pull back from giving too many of the readings about the houses. But if you can find his birth time, we'll talk. So, okay. Let me show you his passport for it. In 55, a couple months after he sprained his ankle, he went from this mean, awesome hero to this dude. Okay, he's 44 years old in this picture. Wow. Or pardon me, he's 43 years old in this picture. He's 43 going up to 70, it looks like. He's bloated. He's got a bearded belly. He's not painting at all. Like in 1956, he made no art. But he still is super successful. About the time he sprained his ankle, a big collector traded a new Cadillac for 2 paintings. And he loved that Cadillac. His wife was in Europe, and he was hanging out with pretty good-looking women who were artists, one woman, Ruth Kligman, had said, if I met Jackson Pollock, I know he would fall for him. So he started an affair with Ruth Kligman in the summer of 1956. And on the night of August 11th, 1956, he was at a party. He got really drunk. He was with a friend. He was with this new girlfriend. Again, the wife's in Europe. And he was with the girlfriend and with her friend. And he got really drunk at the party, and they had to leave. And it was a convertible. And they started driving, and he started driving crazy. And he ended up crashing the car. The girlfriend of Ruth Kligman flew out of the car and died, in addition to him dying. And this is the chart. If you know the date. Ruth Kligman was scorned by the art world for as long as she lived. She made abstract paintings. She wrote a book. She did hook in with a group of people in the art world, but there was an entire group of people who shut out that woman. It's not that they blamed her for his death, and it's not that they ever forgave Pollock for the death of the other passenger, but they circled the wagons on behalf of Lee Krasner. And it may sound really nice, but remember, Lee Krasner inherited everything. And there's now Pollock Krasner grants. Jason McCoy, which is his great-grandnephew at the Jason McCoy Gallery, is a very large, very wealthy estate. And they had no children, so the heirs are that thing. And it's great. It gives out the Pollock Krasner grant. So people really circle the wagons in favor of Lee Krasner. This is the chart of Jackson Pollock's death. This is how we predict. There's nothing in this chart that says you're going to die. But the critical nature of this chart is, if you were my astrology client and I looked at this chart, I would certainly advise you to not get drunk at a party and then drive like a maniac on a country road. So let's look at the chart and see what is telling us specifically not to drive 80 miles an hour on a country road while drunk off our asses. Yeah, convertible. Okay. So, right away, whenever there's an accident, we look at two planets, Mars and Uranus, first and foremost. So right away, where's Mars? Here's Mars, square Venus, square Pluto. Mars square Pluto, don't drive a car. I wouldn't even say drive a car with Mars square Pluto. Well, you know, that's a stay-home kind of thing. Hey, maybe you want to stay there. Maybe you want to stay home that night. Okay, Uranus, disruptive planet, across from the sun. So what you really have with Uranus, and that's a long-term planet. That wasn't there just that night, okay? Uranus was opposite his sun for a while, and it's a very oppressive disruptor. It's really challenging you. It's one thing when society tells you what to achieve, but it's much heavier when you tell you what to achieve. And that's what a Uranus opposition sun is. And so we can see his turmoil front and center with that transit. There's also a square here to Uranus from the moon. And because we know the date, we can use the moon. The moon's moving fast. But moon square Uranus, I'll tell you, man, I drive 45. You know, I mean, that's something to look at. Uranus opposite the sun, long term. Pluto, now remember, when Pluto was opposite Pollock's sun is when he transformed, his genius actually found a way to manifest. But now, Pluto is tense with, again, the Taurus placement of his moon isn't exact, but it is tense with his natal Mars. Pluto squaring your Mars is a long-term thing. It lasts about a year. Sometimes it can last 2 years. It sucks. There's no way around it. And it's worse for a man, or a masculine identifying person. Because the tension from Pluto is again, you fight the change, you get dragged by your hair anyway. Even if you don't have any hair. It falls. So while there is no sudden death transit on the night of August 11, 1956, we do know for a fact that there are some big warnings to not be roaring that car at 80 miles an hour. And sadly, that's Pollock and his demise. But let's go back to Pollock's chart for a discussion of his personality. I just want to give you an overview. I jumped into this. I should have just done this first and then moved on. But we have the Aquarian ego nature, and we have the Taurus need to make objects. Not only does he have the moon in Taurus, he has Saturn and Mars. Mars, the planet of action, in the sign of actually making tangible objects. Taurus, the ultimate materialist object. We have Uranus' ruling planet is in Aquarius. It amplifies the Aquarian nature. It forces that ego to look at infinity. You know, there's a story about Picasso. It's a story about Pollock. He was obsessed with outdoing Picasso. And he went to the Metropolitan Museum one time to dance in new Picassos. In 1940 or 45 when this was, new Picassos were 10-year-old Picassos. and Jackson Pollock was looking and he ran out screaming, "That bastard! That fucking bastard!" And someone cut up to him and said, "What happened?" He goes, "I was onto it. He was onto it 10 years ago." And what it was is if you look at the painting that Picasso had made 10 years prior that it finally made it to the Metropolitan Museum, is that the things that Picasso had figured out 10 years prior, Pollock was going, "I'm the most innovative guy here." That Aquarian nature, that need to be innovative, was driving him, and the only thing he wanted to be more innovative than Picasso. Aquarius is the trendsetter. It has to be the trendsetter. The worst thing that could happen with Aquarius would be to be out of line. And I'll give you an example. Like Sarah Palin is the most conservative person I can think of, but she's an Aquarius, right? But she likes to fuck with the left by going, "I'm so ordinary, I'm ahead of you." You see, that's the Aquarian nature. You guys are all alternative. Well, I'm more alternative than you because I'm talking to people. You know, that's the Aquarian. Ronald Reagan, the great communicator. You know, he You can take the country 100 years back. Okay, let's look forward. Okay? So, what we have here, though, with Pollock, the most tense, because the guy has just fucked up miserable life, so we have to look at the tension in his life. The most exact tension we have is Pluto opposition Venus. There were rumors that Pollock was gay. They're not rumors anymore. He was definitely sexually adventurous and had sex with men throughout his life. I don't want to say that you could predict someone's sexuality through astrology, but I will say that certain things do manifest in people. A Pluto opposition to Venus gives somebody a much more general, open nature on how to love and how to seek emotional consolation. And so there are other aspects that I had a job writing celebrity horoscopes, and Ricky Martin was really popular. And I didn't know who Ricky Martin was. So I'm just looking up Ricky Martin's chart and I'm looking up on Google to find out about this guy. And so my boss, who assigned Ricky Martin, said, "Is he gay? Is he gay?" Let me look. And I said, well, there are 6 planetary indicators of homosexuality. Ricky Martin has 7 of them. So Pollock has the squares and oppositions to Venus, and squares and oppositions to Pluto, and interactions between Pluto and Venus tend to be people who fall in love or are emotionally, sexually attracted outside of the conventional sphere. I think that the repressive nature of society in the 30s and 40s is probably why Pollock got married. Pollock was with a woman because that's what you do. If Pollock had stayed and been born in contemporary times, I don't think he would have felt freer to pursue men. And for what it's worth. The next thing we can look at in the tension is we know Pollock's major conflict in his life was with alcohol. The planet that rules alcohol is Neptune. The tension in Pollock's chart, not only is it opposition Mercury, not only is it opposite Uranus, Mercury, the planet of communication, Pollock could almost only communicate in an illusionist state. His art was abstract, foggy. He was drunk most of the time. The intake and outtake of information had to come through a portal of illusion. Alcohol, quickest way to get there. Uranus, the disruptive planet. Alcohol ruined his life. It constantly created more hurdles than it ever temporarily solved. Uranus opposition Neptune. But more importantly than this, we can do a little, this is where you get really, this is hardcore, but we look at where Venus is in this chart. It's at 28 Sag, and we look at Uranus is at 29 Capricorn. Neptune is at 21. Neptune is almost at the opposite the midpoint of both of them, you see. And so the midpoint between 2 planets in opposition to that can be even more intense. So even though it looks like, oh, this is a very strong opposition, but these are somewhat weak, because there's a midpoint nature involved in there, you got to watch out. So I would say that the alcoholism is definitely, it's one of the few controversial studies that was actually done with alcoholism when they went to AA meetings. And they said, look, we want to help alcoholics. We can prove with astrology that there's alcoholism. We could really help them. And so they did a thing. And the opposition and squares that came up were Venus to Neptune, Venus square Neptune, Venus opposition Neptune. And so there you have it. So Mercury opposition to Neptune, and Uranus opposite Neptune was the whole generation. So, but this was a generation that went to war. Pollock was just old enough that he didn't get drafted for World War II, and he was drafted for because he got a shrink to draft him for him. And so, but it was like, it was not good. You wouldn't want to be in a foxhole with Jackson Pollock. In Lord or peace. But, can we find genius in Jackson Pollock's chart? Where do we look for genius? Well, one of the problems is we don't have the exact birth times, because with birth times we can look at all kinds of sophisticated astrological measurements. And since we can only look at the solar chart, the critical nature for an artist is to look at Venus. And the fact that Venus is opposite Pluto is the most distinct sign of art in Pollock's chart after all of this activity in the material nature of making art. If Pollock didn't have all this Taurus stuff, he might have been an actor, or he might have been a dancer, or he might have been a bus driver, who knows. So, but the fact that he made paintings is, we already know that, but where's the genius? And I would go back to this Pluto opposition Venus, because Pluto is such a powerful, slow-moving, intense transformer. Pluto's so far out there, it takes 200 some years for it to go around. In your lifetime, you may never get some of the Pluto transits that other people get because your planets are in different places. And Pluto's just never going to be there in your life. So Pluto opposition Venus really transforms the artistic impulse. And that really sums up who Pollock was. He constantly wanted to get to be the greatest, to make new art. He was obsessed with getting further out there and really revealing what he considered to be the truths of his time. And that's, many people may aspire to that, but I believe it was pre-programmed in Pollock to be great at something. And the fact that he found abstract art, Clement Greenberg once called him the smartest inarticulate man he ever met. And so what's funny is Aquarius tends to have a lot of use words a lot and a lot of language, but Pollock had just enough friction in his communication skills that he had to do it artistically. It was the only way he ever felt comfortable. He didn't feel comfortable around people, and yet he sought their love and adulation. And so the stars would say, if I was looking at this and said, well, tell me about this person, and I didn't know it was Jackson Pollock, the first thing I would fixate on is that the Venus opposition Pluto. And I wouldn't have to fixate on much more to say that that person was going to have some intense, I'm leaving out the word great, but some intense artistry. The fact that it was all Jackson Pollock worked on and focused on allowed it to become great.